And we should be live here. I'm going to hit go live on one. How are you doing today?
Good.
You've had a busy day.
Good. Yeah, it's been great. But yeah, no, good. How are you doing?
Okay, everything's live now. Well, welcome back. Another week, another show. I mean, well, 2 weeks, another show. I don't know. Most people know it, so it's gonna be a little. It might be a little weird and loud in here. My whole desk is down at my house, and so I'm in my kitchen with all my kids in here. So they're gonna do their best to try to not be loud, but I can almost assure you that they will be loud at some point. And so it'd be a good thing to look at when we're talking about sex selection is which one do you want to really select when you start realizing who's the loudest and being the baddest. And then, as you know, I'm leaving tomorrow, heading to Florida, which is gonna be cool.
Yes. Tomorrow's a big day. Not only is it July 4th, but it's your birthday.
It is my birthday, I know, and lucky for everyone, I thought with me leaving this state and going to Florida, because I heard they were doing the fireworks for me, that they're actually still going to be doing here, which is great. I felt like that was, quite expensive, but still, I was happy that they're still doing that.
Gracious.
No reason for everyone to miss out in, Arizona just because I'm going to Florida. Doesn't make sense. So, very, very happy that they're still doing the fireworks here. So, well, I know, tonight was kind of a topic we wanted to go over. I know a lot of people, wonder about things like sex selection, and it's funny because a lot of times we tend to think that it's odd, like someone will have 5 kids and they all had girls. That's so crazy. How could that happen? And but in reality, it's really not that shocking. I mean, when you actually look at sample size, it's a really small sample size. It's still low probability, but it's not crazy. And so I definitely wanted today, kind of talk about that and talk about, is there really some men out there who only make boys? Is there, and things like that. And so, I don't know, you want to give a little introduction first, just kind of talking about, how this gender gets selected and that, it's on the male side and stuff and kind of a little synopsis about that. And then what we can do is, we'll definitely hopefully get a lot of questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot. We'll talk about things like, how can you select gender? Is it good? Is it accurate? And things like that.
Right. No, it's such an interesting topic. And I think it's always one of those topics that everybody's a little bit shy to talk about it, but I think it's something that is happening in our world of IVF. And I think we should talk about it openly. And one of the interesting things that I'm sure we'll get to it later is that, sex selection isn't legal everywhere. I mean, we, live in a place where it is legal, and we'll get into kind of some of the details maybe of why that's the case and why it's developed like that over time. But I think it's really wonderful that we can have an open conversation about it. I know it's a little bit of a controversial topic for some people.
Yeah.
And, that's the kind of stuff that we just want to bring to the foreground and just kind of talk openly about it and, dig a little bit deeper into it. So I think, one of the interesting ways to almost think about this is to think about the first time this really became an issue for us as doctors, and I just remember this goes back quite a ways during my training. And I remember the conversation came up and, a patient was like, well, can I choose? It looks like, I have a male embryo and a female embryo. And they had the couple right in front of me had a perfect debate of the pros and cons of choosing. And, they eventually decided not to select an embryo based on sex. But we're going to get into all these things about what are the things that should cross our mind as we think about sex selection, when we're thinking about doing it, when we think it's not being done, what the lab is doing to select an embryo on their end. And we'll kind of take it from there. But I don't know, do you have a first time that you remember being exposed to this idea?
I would say that it was one of those things where really we didn't use PGT for that in the beginning, right? And so it was kind of one of those things like, oh, you can do gender. And I remember there was a lot of clinics that didn't do gender. They would just say, we don't allow gender selection. And which I thought was kind of weird because I really don't believe in paternalism like that, where someone can say, oh, you can't choose a gender. You have to, abide by our rules, but we'll put back the healthy pregnancy. And so I was not really for it, but there were places that did that. And I thought it was strange, like why not let people make the choice? But obviously there is a fair concern, right? I mean, you obviously don't want a world where everyone just wants girls or something like that, or the other way around, just want boys. And I think that's more of the concern. And then there's also the ethical dilemma, where as a doctor, you feel like, should I be doing this? Am I letting them bypass things? Although I do find it interesting, and you've heard me talk about this before, like the whole idea of picking sex of your child, it's something that people really do have a tough time with. Matter of fact, if you look statistically in the country, most people actually do feel very uncomfortable with it. It's actually a very uncomfortable thing. So it's not that comfortable, but it's more open now. People feel very comfortable coming in and saying, "Hey, I'm going to do family balancing." But I remember just even 7 years ago, maybe, people come in and they'd be like, kind of like, "Well, we want to do this. Is it possible we put a boy?" Because we kind of like it. I'm like, it's perfectly fine. And there was this kind of fear of talking about it, like you were saying, like, like I don't want to admit to them that I want to pick a gender. They feel like bad people. But what I find funny about it, though, is, and this again, what I've talked about, is like, I love how people, though, are not against it if it wasn't something that can work. So in other words, like I said, wait, if you drink pineapple juice every morning, you'll have a boy, right? And most people are like, yeah, I'll do that. I don't feel bad about that. If it's a certain position, like, okay, I'll do that. If it has that, and no one feels bad about that, because it's their own privacy, their own room. But it's when they come out in public and say, hey, I'm choosing this, and now people can look at them, that's where, because trust me, many people for many, many years have been trying to pick the sex of their child for many, many years. So.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I mean, I think this is, this gets back to this idea of like, I think very generally, like using science to do something that is elective. And, in our field, much of what we do is absolutely not elective. We're going through, people are going through fertility treatment because they've struggled with infertility. And, very, very, very few people are like, yeah, sign me up for IVF, as a first pass. But here, this is something where some people actually do decide that they would like to go through IVF solely for the reason of family balancing or sex selection. But B, there are a lot of people that I think use it, and this I believe is like more common. People use it more commonly. They're going through IVF anyway, and now they're thinking, oh, I already have a girl, maybe I want a boy, or I already have a boy and I want a girl. And I think that's a very fair way to look at it. Is we've already used the technology to, select against aneuploid embryos. And if there's some benefit to that couple to kind of balance, I think that's completely fair. I think the other thing is big population level data. And this is what makes me feel better about it, because I was at first really conflicted about it. And I really wanted to know more about the data. And when you look in the US at our IVF data and for sex selection, there's nearly an even split, a 50-50 split of selection for male embryos and for female embryos across the country, across the years. And so that tells us that, okay, at a population level, we're not kind of doing something that would, significantly disturb what we would have otherwise seen. And we're just helping couples, of course, become pregnant with that embryo. Now, what are some drawbacks, though? What are some drawbacks that you've seen over the years of sex selection, or where can it get us into a little bit of trouble, I guess?
Yeah, I think I can give you an example where at our clinic it actually created a problem, because again, people don't want to play God. And so we will have patients who sometimes want to kind of work the system in a way where they go, listen, I don't want to pick the gender, but I want to put the best embryo back. So then they ask, what's the best embryo? And so you're like, oh, it could be this one, that one. And we actually had this happen where a patient of ours didn't want to pick the gender, but thought they were picking the gender by saying, put back this one, the best one, right? And so what happened was, I get this hysterical phone call telling me how the baby is the wrong gender. And I'm like, I don't understand it. And they're like, it's a girl. And I'm like, yeah, that's what we put back. We put back a girl. They're like, no, you guys put back a boy. So I was really confused. I'm like, I don't know why you think we put back a boy. Is there something, you put in there, put back the best embryos? Because the best embryo was a boy. I'm like, oh, no, it wasn't. And at the time when she spoke to him, it might have been, but we looked at more research. We figured out that certain embryos were doing better in our clinic, and we made that adjustment. So here's the situation where, not being 100% honest that they wanted a gender, ended up causing an embryo to put back that was the right embryo, but it's not really what they wanted. And so, I mean, that's where I think some of that comes from. It goes back to what you said. It's that kind of, taboo topic, as do I say anything? Am I a bad person for doing this? I mean, I'm sure that comes up in people's minds, And then the other area I see is, it's interesting. I feel like sometimes people do more IVF cycles than needed because of it. So, like, for example, when you go and just have a kid, you have a kid and you get what you get. I mean, my wife and I went through, and we would love to be able to know PGT, but we didn't have that possibility. And we got what we got. But it's interesting. You see people, and they'll get like 6 or 8 embryos, and maybe there's not a boy in there, right? And so then they'll do another cycle trying to get a boy or something like that. And it's just, sometimes I feel bad that, like, oh, it's almost like ignorance is bliss type of situation where, before you wouldn't even worry about it. You would have just gone in and have kids, and now you're worried that you don't have this one, sex that you wanted. And so those are some areas. And then obviously there's the ethical areas that we can get into, like why Canada and stuff doesn't allow it, and in the UK and stuff like that. But is that what you were talking about, or is it something more of a different area you're talking about?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I mean, now the other thing that you're talking about is kind of like, definitely, in other countries, they allow very limited amounts of selection based on PGT. I mean, in certain places, Canada has a lot more restrictions around sex selection, disclosing the sex of the embryo on PGT testing, things of that kind. In other countries, of course, you cannot, sex select. That is, kind of seen as illegal in those places. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I think that, again, when we take a look at sex selection, it's one of the very, very few things that where we're selecting an embryo, not based on a disease that it has, and not based on really quality of the embryo. We're just basing it on an elective thing. And I think it's just important to have that honest discussion. Like, hey, maybe we're choosing a less good embryo, or in other words, maybe we're transferring an embryo that has a lower chance of implanting and leading to a pregnancy than the embryo of the sex that wasn't your first choice. And in that case, I think that's where it can get us into, like, I wouldn't say it gets us into trouble, but I think it's important to have an honest conversation about it. And sometimes I've seen, I've had some patients where they'll have a day 7 embryo, has a much lower chance of implanting compared to like a day 5 A8 embryo that's genetically normal. And I say, hey, this is a very drastic difference between these two embryos in terms of how likely it is to implant and go all the way through to a successful pregnancy. And, I think as long as we're clear on that, they people tend to be okay with it. But I think that's where I've run into some trouble with it in the past, is really kind of understanding that you can give up a lot when you have an embryo that's maybe of the other sex, but it's a much higher quality. And that's where it's always a little difficult.
I just had a case like that where, just the other day, and someone put back, a day 7 embryo was good, but they wanted the gender, and so for that reason, it unfortunately didn't work. And, they probably would put back one of the other embryos, probably would work, by the way. And so you're right. It really is interesting. And what's really interesting about that too, is from a clinic standpoint, I thought about that the other day. I'm like, wow, we won't let people just put back a poor embryo if they want to put back a poor embryo. But if they pick gender, we go, oh, okay, then we'll do it. We'll let them have the sex of the baby matters. But if they say, hey, can I put back my worst embryo, and we didn't know the sex of the babies, we would say, no, why would you do that? You put your best one forward. Yet even we realize that, like, sex is an important thing. And it should be sometimes, because I mean, there are, I think I'm gonna give you my personal opinion. So this is just, my own opinion. It's not shared by anyone else. I do think that, it probably should be limited to a point. Like if someone's only having one kid, I don't know how comfortable, I do feel with people just picking sex, right? Because again, that's where you get to things like in, other countries, China, and I think where they get worried about, only having one gender. In India, another, place that there's concern of having just one gender because everyone wants a boy if they're having one kid. But I do think, eventually, like, okay, well, they have two kids. They haven't got that. I don't see the harm in that situation. I don't even see the ethical harm in that situation. And again, I'm sure there are people out there who could, explain to me where the harm is in that. But because again, if we're going to talk about probability, statistically speaking, if even if it's not that one family, right? If you do it across the board and it's not random, then you will end up with too much of one sex than the other, and then obviously that can create other problems in the world. I really hope people come on, because I mean this is a topic that we can talk about a bunch about the medical statistics and stuff, but please ask questions, and please come on, because you will ask things that we never think of. We're just a bunch of nerds, sitting there talking about medical stuff, but in the end, like, things that you may ask is like, hey, my husband's brother has this and this, and they all have boys. Is there something wrong with them? And that's one of the things I was talking about at the beginning, is that no one can have just boys, just girls, right? So it's important for everyone to understand that every single DNA cell in the guy is XY, and then from there it makes one X and one Y sperm, and then that splits into two X and two Y sperm. So you always have equal amount of the sperm. But interesting about that, I'm sure you've heard like people talk about that the embryos might mature at different rates, and that with fresh transfers there was a higher there was some mild trends and stuff like that. And so now with freeze-alls it doesn't matter, now it's just purely random, but I know that was something that came up. So statistics, I think it's really interesting. I was trying to put something together before this about statistics, meaning what are the chances, right? Like how rare is it to get to the point of having 5 kids or something with that? And so obviously having one kid's 50-50, 2 it's 1-4, and so forth and going on. And when you get to just 5 kids, it ends up being like a 3.125% chance that you will end up with all the same thing. And that, first of all, what does that mean? I mean, like, is there any real world example that could make up for that? And 5 is like 1 in 32. And so one of the things I found was looking at poker hands. And so apparently, kind of looking from that standpoint, there's looking at certain poker hands. What could you get with those different poker hands? And so, I don't know, like I said, I did a little thing on it. And so for 5 kids, it was like getting a straight. So I don't know if you play poker, but if you play poker, getting a straight is pretty much how common it is. And to get to all the way to 8 kids and still have the same gender, it'd be 1 in 256, which is about the rate of getting identical twins. So if it gives you an idea, it says, okay, well, how rare are identical twins? How many do you know? You take that same number, go, okay, that is the same probability I see twins, that a family would have 8 kids and all be the same gender. So it's pretty rare. I mean, when it really thinks about it, most of these are families of like 3 and 4, and that this stuff happens.
Yeah, that's a really neat way to think about it. I hadn't thought about it in terms of those probabilities and those odds. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it is pretty rare. Now, I guess, one thing that oftentimes comes up is when somebody falls into that group and they say, well, we only make boys or we only make girls. And, is there any evidence that that's the case, or that people only make good embryos that are only boys or only girls? And, I think there are some very rare, gene disorders that one could potentially come across, that would be like on a Y chromosome, that would make it such that the embryo is less compatible with life. I think there are some, a few different conditions here or there, but they're very rare. So I think the short answer is, outside of very, very rare things, by and large, I mean, it should be about 50-50 in terms of how the chromosomes segregate. And so, yeah, it's possible that you go through PGT and you get 8 embryos that are all of one sex. That's very possible, just like with those odds you were talking about. But it certainly doesn't mean in your next cycle that would happen.
Yeah, it was independent. So, flip the quarter every time. When you flip the quarter, it's still another 50-50.
Right.
You brought up a point though about almost like X-linked diseases. So, like you said, like it's something in the sperm or something on that side, and as you and I were talking about in other countries, usually most countries allow for that. So if there is a disease that runs on the Y, or something like that, in that situation, or X-linked disease where having a boy could be a medical issue, then in those situations they allow sex selection most time. But other than a few countries, I mean, we are really, interesting enough, the exception. I mean, us in Mexico. And what's interesting about that, I find, is that we don't allow three-party, creation. So you can't use mitochondria from another woman and have a child. Yet we allow sex selection. So it's interesting. Whereas Canada doesn't allow sex selection, but then they do allow you to use, three-party creation. And so, so I thought that was kind of interesting.
One of the questions I just got kind of on a feed here, it was about, if a patient was just saying, I went through and I went through a cycle in order to get a girl, and I got all male embryos. Kind of what are my options with those embryos, and what can I do moving forward? I still would like to try to get a girl embryo. So it's interesting though. So they had normal male embryos, but they wanted a female, and they don't know what to do with those embryos. So this is kind of a little offshoot of what we're talking about, but it's related. Obviously we always talk about these things. It's very important that with your clinics that they have a very clear, disposition consent of what to do with embryos. And embryos are treated, of course, as that person's, property and that couple's property. So they're allowed to, of course, do with them what they want. I mean, common things, of course, would be discarding the embryos. It would be, keeping them frozen into perpetuity. It would be donating the embryos to a couple in need. It would potentially be, keeping them frozen, going through another transfer in the future. I will say one thing, and this is the reason this came up and it caught my eyes. I did have a couple in the past that came across this, and it is that I would absolutely not discard the embryos until you are completely done with your family building goals. And I remember I had one couple that very unfortunately came across this scenario, and I think they thought they were only going to want to, that sex, that one particular sex. And so they discarded the embryos, and very tragically, they decided later on that they wanted to, go through IVF to have another child. They were never able to sex select. They wanted to go through IVF to have another child. And the ovarian reserve had really, really, gone south, and they were having a very hard time, getting embryos again. And I just remember that as a particular case that for me was very sad, and one of those that's, stood out, that said, hey, please keep your embryos frozen until you're done, creating your family. But yeah, I don't know. How would you tackle that, Dr. Amols?
I mean, exactly like you said, I have actually had that exact same scenario. When you were saying, I was like, that's weird. A very similar episode where someone, discarded embryos and then later, realized, like, I get this a lot with people are like, oh, we're just having one kid, and I always tell them, like, you never know. I said, it's just weird when you look that little one in the eyes. It's so hard not to say I want a second one and things like that. So, you brought up when you kind of talked about that point, like, about, like you said, discarding those embryos. It brought up a story I remember of this couple, and it killed me. A young couple, they had like a girl. No, that's right. They had a boy first, and then they had a daughter, and they had no infertility problems, by the way. And at this point, the guy's like, hey, we had our kids. Let's stop, having kids. I don't want to have any more accidents. So he did the responsible things. Like, I don't want to have any more kids. Went and got his a vasectomy. Unfortunately, a tragic happened, and they lost their daughter. And they did not want to, like they want to go reversal, or like we want a daughter again, like we have everything for my daughter and stuff like that, which is, I mean, just heartbreaking. And the insurance wouldn't let him do it. It was actually really crazy. And they said, well, because he went and had a vasectomy, and I had to get on the phone and fight with him about it and tell him like, yeah, he had vasectomy because they were done. They're like, well, we tell people don't do it. You never know what's happening. I go, no one thinks about their child, that's when. But there are other situations, like I said, like that. And I've had it actually with other people who've had stillbirths and stuff, and they want to get back to that point. And I get it. I mean, I totally understand that. And so there's, like I said, it's used in lots of ways. I know we have someone who's potentially on here to talk about. There was a question someone asked, which I think is a very good question. And they asked, like, is it ever wrong? Is PGT ever incorrect? And it is kind of a tricky question to answer in some ways, because it's not so much that the PGT is wrong, but more that it's not perfect to test, is the way I would look at it. And I think what's important for people to understand is, as we're taking 4 or 5 cells from this embryo, and then we have to amplify it. You cannot run a test on 4 to 5 cells of DNA. And then that has to be amplified over and over and over to make enough DNA to be able to run tests on. And the problem with it is that when you make those copies, you're copying a copy. So you're copying and copying, copying and copying. And then there can be things called dropout, where some of the DNA drops out and you don't get it. And so back in the day when we did FISH technique, which is where we would basically have like a probe go attached to the DNA, and we say, oh, if it has an Y, it's a boy. If it didn't, we assumed it was a girl. We made that assumption. We no longer do that anymore. So that was not very accurate, and that was wrong a lot. Now, when we do arrays and things like that, it's much more accurate, because we can look at the actual entire chromosome, and not just looking to see if it's possibly there or not. But that being said, it's actually not perfect. And there are many areas there can be errors. So, for example, you can have errors in the test, like I was just talking about, being noisy, so where the test looks like there's something that's not there. And about 25 cases a year occur in this country where there is actually the wrong gender, not the wrong embryo. So people, sometimes get it's their embryo, but it's just the wrong gender. Some of those cases have shown up to be transcription errors. So someone's just taking anything, goes, oh boy, and someone actually writes girl or human. And so they write down the wrong gender. And so some companies have even gone to just where computers do it, and so there's no humans involved. There's always the possibility when you mark stuff and then it goes to other place and then they switch them, or at the place they made them, it got switched. There is that small possibility, but it sounds like a big number, 25. But I mean, when you think about, I forgot, I mean, you probably know, Dr. Salem, how many cycles are done a year, but I mean, 25 cases is actually very, very small. I mean, it's got to be like one in like every 10,000 or something like that. But it's not perfect. And so the answer is it ever incorrect? It is, but not so much the test is wrong. It's just the test isn't perfect. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, Dr. Sam, because I do tell people this, like it's extremely accurate, but it's not perfect.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. So just because I geek out over those things, total number of cycles per year in the US right now is hovering around 350,000 cycles. Yes. So, I mean, we're talking about extraordinarily low numbers. Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of is it wrong? I think that we're working with such low numbers of, is it wrong, that we have to be okay with something. There has to be, nothing is perfect when it comes to biology, and that number is about as close as you can get to it. And so, especially for sex. And by the way, that's roughly in the same ballpark of the non-invasive prenatal testing, NIPT, that a woman can undergo, sometime between 8 and 10 weeks of pregnancy to know the sex of the embryo that she's pregnant with at that time. So it's not, that test is obviously not perfect either. So again, the important thing here is that none of these quote unquote screening tests are absolutely perfect. But yeah, I know that, now we were talking about, sorry, I'll bring it back. I'll bring it back to you, Dr. Amols, because I think there was another question that you wanted to bring on as well. I saw it in the comment section there.
Well, yeah, and I was mentioning also that we have someone who's interested to come on and asking a question too. And like I said, we could geek out on this forever, but I think the main point that someone was asking is, does it happen? The answer is yes. You know, I actually calculated for us, it's 1 in 14,000. So 1 in 14,000, you know, cycles is ending up the wrong gender. Not all of those ended up doing PGT. So, you know, and not all those had a transfer of gender. So it could be a lot less than that. But the actual test being wrong itself is pretty much less than 1% for just gender, not for other problems. Other problems it's not as perfect for, but for gender, that ends up being the thing. So, yeah, let me bring on our guest here, and we'll see. I'd love to hear questions here. How's it going?
Hey, Dr. Amols, happy birthday.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so I think I just kind of wanted to share because, you know, Jacqueline and I actually, with our instance, we changed our thoughts on this. You know, I think originally we were, you know, against choosing. You know, we wanted to leave it up to, you know, we're religious, so we wanted to leave it up to God as much as we could with going through IVF already. But it's so funny, you just shared the story 5 minutes ago, which mirrors our story, right? It's a story of deprivation where we were deprived being girl parents, you know, because we had Ellie, she was born, and then we lost Ellie. So, you know, Jacqueline and I are like, we feel like girl parents. You know, we talked about all of the things we would do with Ellie as girl parents. So through that deprivation, I think it's really possible for somebody to change their mind on this and they can flip flop. And I think whichever side of the fence you arrive on is completely fine. But, you know, I think people should know that, you know, it's okay, whatever side of the fence you do end up on, and you might change your mind, you might change sides at different times, like we did, you know, because we were deprived of what we thought we were going to have.
Yeah, no, I mean that's why I wasn't actually thinking of your guys' story, but I mean, yes, I mean there's so many of these stories, and I think it kind of makes sense. I mean, I've made the comment before: the minute you see that positive pregnancy test, you start thinking about all the things you're going to do as a parent. You're like, oh, I'm going to do this with them, I'm going to do this with them, and once you find out the sex, you just it's like when it's ripped away from you from that standpoint. You know, I just, like I said, and I'm so sorry. Obviously, you know, I know Dr. Salem and I always horrible cases like that, and yeah, I think that's why I think it's warranted. I think it is gender it being allowed sex is a reason for that, and that's why I was sharing that one about that one couple where, you know, I had to fight the insurance to get that for them. So, do you mind if I ask you, you know, from, and this is just kind of a question I have, so
Yeah.
on the spot. From a religious standpoint, because I'm a pretty religious person too myself. What is it that caused you to feel that you shouldn't be able to do that with religion? Because again, that's something I asked myself, and I'm very logical. And I love,
You know,
to know
funny
your
enough,
experience.
I don't think it's actually pressure from anything I ever read in the Bible myself. I think it was pressure from people, you know, people's opinions on
Mhm.
first IVF in general, that, oh, you know, being around the church, being around a lot of people. Of course, there's plenty of people that are supportive because they know we want to bring a child of God into
Yeah.
this world. But you still have those people that are very, oh, you know, you should just leave it in God's hands, that, you know, if you're meant to have a child, you will. That's kind of offensive, you know.
Yeah.
You know, second of all, it's like, well, what's not to say? You know, I don't know if you ever saw the joke where the guy was drowning and he was religious and he kept praying to God, 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 please save me. And a guy shows up with a rowboat and he's like, hey, get on the boat. And he's like, no, 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 I'm God's going to save me. And then a helicopter shows up and he says, oh, you know, no, 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 God's going to save me. I'm a devout, I'm a devout Catholic. God's going to save me. I'm praying to God. And then he dies and he gets to heaven and God goes, I sent a guy with a boat and a helicopter. What else you want? Well, I got, you know, we have a doctor that is very skilled in doing this. So that's how we accepted IVF initially, but there was still the next level of pressure was, okay, you're doing IVF, we understand, but you know, genetic testing, you know, picking and choosing, you know, you're taking that, you know, into your own hands. So I think there was kind of external pressure, not from anything, like I said, that I've actually read in scripture, but more so just people and their opinions. And of course, people's opinions sometimes influence what we do.
Yeah, that's just actually how I look at it. I make this argument to patients. I go, listen, I don't. God works through mine and Dr. Salem's hands, and it helps us do this stuff. It's not we have this ability, and yeah, that's the way I look at it. It's like I'm the helicopter coming in, and that's exactly how it is. And if he gives that ability, then like I said, I was always interested because I always wonder what other people think in that situation. I really appreciate you sharing your story. Any other questions you have for us while you have us on here about?
I guess a lighthearted one. Do you guys have a joke in the office yet? Because the talk show is the sperm and the egg. So you have two mascots, you have two hosts. Which one of you are the sperm and which one's the egg?
I guess we haven't divvied those responsibilities out yet. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. We really haven't. That's a good point. It's I'm gonna I feel like I'm being mean, but right now my hair is a little bit longer because I'm trying to donate. So it's kind of the tail. And Dr. Salem's head's a little bit shinier, like an egg. I feel like that might be the Pharaoh's for now, but that can change in time. So
I've been claimed to have an egghead in the past. Yeah, that's fair.
Thanks a lot, Dakota.
Seriously, thank you so much for sharing that story. That's very profound, and I really love your perspective on things. I love hearing people's different perspectives, how they arrive to IVF. I mean, how they arrive to fertility care, and it's so insightful. Just getting a chance to hear that. So again, thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you both.
So yeah, absolutely. He brings a good point. And there are people who are even afraid to do IVF because of religious reasons. And so it is. There's a lot of pressure on people, and I still think there is pressure with gender. So by the way, I don't think most people would share that. I mean, I don't even know if I would. I think if my wife and I did that, they'd be like, "Oh no, it just happened," because it's kind of weird thing. Like whenever I tell people we have twins, they always go, "Oh, did you do IVF?" And I'm like, "None of your business." But I'm not gonna tell you. One other question I saw here was, it said, "Can a certain sex lead to miscarriage? Like if you miscarried because it was a boy?" And she said, and you kind of were touching on that a little bit earlier. Is that there could be things that are linked to something. I'm not aware of anything specifically, but I mean, yes, the probability is it's possible. So anything you could think of, like I could think of like something, for example, is someone had like a mosaic Turners, right? Or something like that, and then they were passing along an extra chromosome, or like, if someone had Klinefelters but had sperm, it could lead to some problems. Like there are certain things, but not just in general. I mean, usually the thing is most disorders that cause that will lead you to either not have kids, isn't one of the big things, and versus having a bunch of miscarriages. But I don't know, you may think of something I'm not thinking of.
Well, no, we're thinking of the same things. I mean, one of the other things that's like, a lot of men who go through male factor infertility, that might have like a Y chromosome microdeletion, right? And it can be one of these, it doesn't affect them in any way except that they just don't make a lot of sperm. And maybe we're able to get over that hump in the road with the help of our colleagues, like, reproductive urologists. They'll extract the sperm, etc. But then if that couple ends up having a male, we know that Y chromosome, that there's only one place it's coming from, and it's not the egg. And so we know that it's going to affect that individual as well. So that's like one example of where we start seeing some of these things, where if you're selecting for a certain sex, you might have an increased risk of a certain disease. Or another one would be like fragile X. There's a possibility with the expansion of that trinucleotide repeat. So there's a few of them, but again, this is where it's important. Like, I'm glad we're kind of talking through this out loud, because when you ask this kind of question, just like broadly, it's hard to think and remember of all of them at the same time. But when we have a patient in front of us and we kind of review everything for that specific patient, and then we're like, oh, but, we're going through infertility in your specific case because of male factor, because of, AZFC or whatever, microdeletion, some reason. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what that means for a boy you would have in the future. Yep. I think that's kind of part of it. There was another question that I think was related to this one. It was very related. And it was saying, can the age affect can the age of what I imagine is the parent affect the quality of the sex of the embryo? And so it's very related to this thing that we're talking about right now. And I was trying to think about, where that pops up most commonly. And the one that I can really think of that we're seeing more research around it is just a relationship. It's autism, right?
Yeah,
so,
exactly what I was thinking.
autism spectrum disorders, I have many people that I know who are identified as that. I have people that I know that have children who are identified as that, and they live very healthy, full lives. But what we do know about this spectrum disorder is that we do see a higher prevalence of it, a higher incidence. Like, you have more cases of it as the paternal age gets higher, and with boys over girls. So, what's the way to kind of have the lowest autism risk at a population level? Well, it's a young dad and a girl, and having a girl. And what's the highest chance? Again, these chances are still very, very low, remember, but the highest chance would then be all the way on the other side of the spectrum, would be having a very kind of elderly father having a boy. And so, that's kind of one that comes to mind. But are there other ones that come to mind? I'm probably not thinking of all of them right on the spot here.
No, I mean, I think, that's the big one, obviously, and I mean, there are, I was thinking of like, certain disorders that the child may make it to birth, but, not be alive. And so, you hear about like, oh, I've had 6 kids, but all the boys, died at infancy and stuff like that. Like there are things like that, but those are all, again, back to the genetics. There's nothing I know of in the female age that's going to cause, boys or girls to be unhealthy. I was trying to think about it. I mean, I can't imagine, I was thinking Fragile X in my head, but again, really, I think that you were thinking the same one. I mean, that's the one we know for sure what paternal age could have effects and stuff like that. And it's more of a disease state versus making the girl or boy bad. But like you said, the penetrance of that disease is stronger in one gender than the other sometimes. And so, the one thing I want to talk about, and I think because we have about 20 minutes left, and is how can you pick gender? Because I think this is something that's also a little bit of a shock for people. I get people coming all the time like, yeah, we want to pick the gender of our kid, and we're just going to do an IUI, and I'm like, oh no, and they're like, what? I go, well, IUIs aren't going to help you pick gender, and they seem surprised. I'm like, and the thing is, there's a lot of stuff on the internet. And one of the things that's been on there for many, many years is sperm sorting. And this idea that you can sort sperm. Now, interesting enough, I'm going to talk about something that we're doing a research on this as well. But at least the previous sperm sorting has not been shown to be effective, higher than just chance. And but again, if you read online, they make it sound like it's absolutely working. And my comment I always tell people is this: I say, listen, if it really worked, I can assure you every clinic would be doing it, because it would be like a cash cow. I mean, like, people would be lined about the door. I mean, people have been trying to pick gender, and that's something where it's like, hey, I'm not doing too much. I'm not doing IVF. I'm not bypassing God too much. I'm just, sperm sorting. And so I was wanting to see what you thought about. Have you had that question brought up, and what you've talked to patients about? And then I was going to talk about this. There was a newer method for it recently, and we're actually going to be doing a study on that. And I expect it not to be to be good, but we'll find out. But it was just the study that was done that showed an 80% selection rate. So
right. No, the sperm sorting thing has always been great, because this question has come up so many times, and I always tell people, I say sperm sorting is fantastic. It works perfectly 50% of the time, and somehow they've been able to market it with this kind of pseudoscience. And in the studies, when they try to like show you, what actually happens downstream, it still is in line with the overall, fraction in the population, which, by the way, it's important to remember this. The fraction in the population leans a little bit more heavily towards boys. It's about 1.06 males for every female. If people are selecting for males and they show that it works a little bit more than 50% of the time, then it's just about the natural ratios. So that's been my experience with it. It's also very frustrating though for patients, because I think that there is a lot of information online, which again makes it seem like there's real science behind it. And, you're getting the lighter sperm from the top of the supernate, and you're doing all this kind of stuff. And so you're going to preferentially select all the lighter, DNA, which is the one with the Y chromosome. And unfortunately, it just doesn't pan out. And so, yes, the lowest entry to sex selection in our world, prior to being pregnant, of course, is PGTA and testing at that day 5 blastocyst stage. And that's just that for right now. But I'll turn it back over to you, because I know you have some exciting things to share.
Well, and I've had patients, like there's still some clinics out there that use fish technology, and I tell people all the time, like, do not trust that. I mean, that is something that is not even looking for the DNA. It's just basically looking for a luminescence that says, oh, look, the Y's there, but it could be wrong. Or if it's not there, it's assumed it's a girl, and they go, well, it's not a boy, and it could still be a boy. And so I think when you're talking about ability to have a gender, I think it's important to understand that there is no special position. There's no special food that you can take that will make you have a boy over a girl. Number two, at this time, at least, we do not have a way to sort sperm to be able to pick gender. And I don't think that's ever going to be possible to 100%. I mean, we were talking about something on, the Dalton levels of measurements of weight. And it's just so hard to separate that. Really the only way to do it now and to work well is with PGT. Now, exciting is eventually, I know right now we're all looking at things like spent fluid from, an embryo and going, hey, can we do PGTA testing on that? And maybe it won't ever be great. But I mean, if it can hit gender 80% of the time, people are like, hey, I don't have to do a biopsy, and they can pick the embryo has an 80% chance of being the gender I want, right? So there is some exciting things like that coming out. There was a study where we read about where this guy came up with this new method. And it's a really interesting method. It is done different. I've actually looked at the sperm sorting method because I thought, hey, that's great if it really works. It's a really unique method that they use. It's using multiple gradients, and it actually puts the sperm in a cold environment, which is unusual. You only usually put sperm cold, it hurts it. And I think it has something to do with like slowing it down, like the kinetics of it. And in this study, they were saying they were getting 80% of the sex that they were trying to get. Now, what was interesting is, though, it wasn't like they were doing IVF, right? So they're like putting sperm in, and someone's getting pregnant. I'm like, well, yeah, now you're adding so many, confounders here now. I mean, and so what we're going to do is we're actually going to do it, separate it. We have an IRB. We've been waiting like months to get this IRB through approval, but we're going to now take that, and we're going to then split it up with PGTA and determine, did it really get the gender that it said it would. So it'd be interesting to find out if it works, and if it does, I'll definitely be here to tell everyone about it. And I'm sure every clinic on earth is going to start doing it if that shows up. What do you think of this of the idea, though, of this spent DNA is left over from the spent fluid of the embryo that is in the culture dish? If that was able to even get it 60%, right? I mean, that's not unreasonable, right? If someone's like, listen, I just want a higher chance, that's not unreasonable. You're not guaranteeing anything. You're like, hey, we're not guaranteeing anything. We're just saying these ones probably have a higher chance because it's showing up and we didn't have to do anything to the embryo, no biopsy or anything. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, no, the spent embryo culture, and the cells being kind of sloughed off from the embryo and kind of evaluating that. I mean, I think it's a very exciting thing. And I really do hope that, 5-10 years from now, that's going to be maybe more of the standard of how we test embryos. The data so far suggests that there's like a pretty good correlation between what we're seeing in the spent embryo culture and the PGT, but it's just not like high enough. It's like you're saying, it's like some studies are like 60%, some studies 70%. I actually worked on a study with my colleague, Dr. Jackie Ho, who she was the lead and did an amazing job with this study. And I just kind of learned much about this from her. And, what she found was just that doing the trifectoderm biopsy is still a lot better. But there are ways to amplify the DNA from the spent culture media. And anyway, long story short, it's like, hey, here's a really cool way where we don't even have to pluck a couple cells off of the embryo and we still get an idea about what's going on inside of the embryo. And so, again, could this potentially reduce the invasiveness of IVF? Could it improve the success rates of those specific embryos? Could it reduce cost? I mean, you and I are always looking at how do we make IVF more attainable for more people at the highest level, and this is the kind of thing that gets me very excited because, if you could more easily, evaluate an embryo, here's a more cost-effective way to be able to do PGT for more people. So I'm excited about it. I know it's not game time ready yet, though. It's one of those things that the technology, they just need to tweak it a little bit.
There's I spoke to one of the guys who's working on AIs of images of embryos. Obviously they're looking at that to determine about aneuploidy and things like that. And I asked him, I said, can it determine gender? And he believes at some point it's going to that, which is crazy in my mind because, when you think about it from a cellular level, right, we obviously are physically different, right? But from a cellular level, I mean, like we both got kidneys, we both have eyeballs. There's certain things we have, right? And there's certain features about us that make us different. But it's crazy to think that even at that very early portion and that cellular portion that there could be differences, that can be seen through AI. And again, we can't see it because it's looking at so many parameters that we can't even comprehend to look at. But it would be really cool if that comes up. And so if people are looking for, like, is there any other way to pick gender? The answer is potentially coming up in the future, but may not be while I'm practicing. It might be years and years ahead. But people are always looking at that. So let's see if we have any other questions. I know, I'm trying to think if we covered kind of most of the topic I wanted to talk about today. Anything you have to add to the topic? I know, like I said, I'm planning on, I'm going to be leaving tomorrow, so I got to get all my stuff packed and stuff too. So we're definitely going to ending here on time. But if anyone else has a question or anything, please send it through. We're more happy to answer. But anything you want to end on that you have?
I think, the biggest thing that probably like my take home of this conversation that I'd love to leave like a lot of our community with is make sure that when you're thinking about sex selection, that you are prioritizing it in the right order with the other things that matter to you. And make sure that you talk with your doctor about that. When you think about, this is a very nuanced conversation, it has to be really personalized to your specific condition. And it's not just, I'm going to go through IVF because I have infertility and I'm going to do sex selection. Make sure you're asking all the right questions about, am I really transferring the better embryo? Is there an order of things that might make more sense? In certain cases, do I get to a point where, I need to maybe go through another IVF cycle and then I have 2 cycles worth of embryos that are banked? I think these are all very, very valid questions. And I really encourage people to kind of ask those questions as they're going through, maybe prioritizing in my list of things, what's the number one most important thing? Is it becoming pregnant or is it the sex selection portion? And then the number 2, how would, for example, going through the process, let's say I wanted a girl, but then I used up my girl embryos and I only have male embryos left over. How will I feel about that? You don't want to, I imagine one doesn't want to feel like that was their second choice necessarily at that point. So it's just kind of coming to terms with that. But those would be the kind of highlights of what I'd love to kind of leave this conversation with. But I don't know. How about you?
Yeah, I think the other thing I would want to talk about, and those are all great points, and I think you're right. I mean, disposition is going to be the thing, but it's also just understanding like that it's not just the probability of getting the embryos you want. So one of the things I always sit down with patients about is actually go over the statistics. And the reason why is because I think one of the things we forget about is the age of the patient plays a part in these statistics. Because if you are, let's say, 25 years old, and we know that maybe only 30-40% of your embryos are going to be aneuploid, if you're going for, let's say, a girl or a boy, either way, you say, okay, if I have 10 embryos and 5 of them come back one gender, even if all the aneuploids end up in that one gender, you still got chew that you can use. But if you are 42 and 85% of your eggs are pretty much abnormal, aneuploid, and you get 10 embryos, now more embryos will be abnormal than normal. And so to get, let's say, a boy, and let's say 5 are boys, 5 are girls, even using those type of statistics, it is possible all the boys could be abnormal and you still don't have it. So that's the other thing I like to prepare people for, is that even though we can tell you here's a gender, we can't make a gender. We can only let you put back a gender. And I know I keep saying gender because I should be saying sex, but again, I'm older and I just don't have the lingo down very well. But in the end, I like to make sure they understand those statistics, because that's the part I think that's really heartbreaking, is that when someone's 38, they go through and they get 5 girls, and 2 boys, and all the girls are abnormal, and they're like, oh, I didn't realize that there's that other part of the aneuploid that could affect this. I think that's a hard part, and I really like what you were saying earlier about that decision making too, because I think of like people who have like Project, great company, they offer fertility benefits for people. But, when you look at these smart cycles, and you might only have one transfer that's covered by your insurance. And so, like you said, what's more important, being pregnant the first time or having the gender? And so those are things that, that I think are important conversations, because like I said, you'd hate for someone to go in, and there's something about even failing IVF that's just so difficult. I mean, when it fails, you start to think it's never going to work, right? And so that's why someone asked me the other day, why do you always put the best one back first? And I said, well, if you put the worst one back first and it doesn't work, then the question is, well, is there something wrong with your body that we need to look at? Do we need to look at something else? Or is it just embryo wasn't the best one, right? And so by putting the best one back, you're able then, if it doesn't work, to go, okay, something else might be going on, right? And I think there's a reason why we put the best one back. And so, like I said, that point you made about that, it is critical. So, well, I know, like I said, we're near the end here. I didn't see any other things. I saw someone was appreciative that I did say sex and gender. Every time I kept saying that, I'm like, oh, not gender, sex. And so, really appreciate your time. I'm going to be enjoying the fireworks in Florida. Hopefully you're going to be having a fun time, Dr. Salem. I don't know what you're going to do for 4th of July.
Yeah, thanks for leaving those fireworks behind for us on your birthday. Really appreciate it.
I mean, it wasn't my decision. The city did it. And I was just like, I felt like, wow, that's a lot of money for me not being here. But, what can I say? I'm quite appreciative that everyone should be very thankful to the cities that are doing that. And if you're lucky enough to be in Florida, now that I'm there, apparently they're doing it too. So again, if you're in Fort Lauderdale, get to see some fireworks. So, I appreciate everyone that has been coming and stuff. I think the big thing to leave this today is that, the only thing you can do now that helps you fix gender is going to be something like BGT. There might be things in the future, and understand that it comes with a lot of emotions, a lot of ethics. And I think one of the stories we heard today from Dakota, who came on today, is if you are someone who sometimes thinks it's wrong to do it, think about those situations. Think about the fact that, imagine if you lost a child and you would get back to that point. And so it's easy for sometimes us to criticize or look at things, but there's a lot of reasons why people pick the sex of the child, and it's not always wrong, and it's not always right. It's their decision, and that's never wrong. So,
yeah. Well, thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you for coming on as well, Dakota, and have a lovely birthday and a happy 4th to everybody.
Yeah, happy 4th of July. And as always, I'd like to always thank Ari, who is nice enough to be in the background helping with stuff. Dr. Salem and I are not talented enough to be looking at all the questions and everything at the same time. So she goes through, stars them, gets them ready, and tells the people that we're going to be getting them on air. So thank you, Ari, for everything.
Of course.
You guys all have a great night.
Bye.
Bye.